That afternoon, on a winter day so cold it blurred the edges of Manhattan, I realized some laughs can change the course of a person's life. Not the warm or friendly kind, but the kind that slips out when someone looks at you like an object they have just discovered is not worth what they once assumed. The conference room I stood in could make anyone feel small. It was the largest room on the top floor of Harbor Point's headquarters, surrounded by glass, looking straight down at Central Park, hazy under the late afternoon mist. Everything in that room carried the same unspoken message. The people who sat here mattered, and the ones who walked in, people like me, mattered far less. Even the temperature was a few degrees colder, as if the chill itself were part of the company brand. I sat across from Charles Denton, the chief executive officer of Harbor Point. He was 56, tall, salt and pepper hair cut short, eyes that scanned people the way someone might weigh whether you were worth their time. I had worked under him for 14 years, long enough to recognize that look. Between us on the table was the thick folio I had spent a week preparing, hard bound so it could hold the weight of 5 years of my work. I began my presentation. My voice was steady, neither rushed nor hesitant. I talked through the healthcare premium pricing models I had developed, models that helped slash loss ratios in three major states and pushed our customer retention to what internal reports once called beyond expected improvement. I listed the growth percentages my models directly contributed to, numbers Charles himself had praised during a quarterly meeting. I was not bragging. I was stating facts the way someone trained in numbers would do it. Clearly, with evidence, without flourish. When I finished, I turned to the last page of the folio. I had spent a long time deciding how to write that page. It was a single line, a request for a 10% salary adjustment. I explained it was not excessive, just enough to bring my compensation closer to market rate, which had shifted dramatically after the pandemic. I added that the increase would not strain the human resources budget, but it would help me feel appropriately recognized. Then I stopped, giving him space to respond. I did not know what I expected, but it certainly was not what happened next. Charles leaned back in his chair and burst into laughter. Not the kind born from confusion or amusement. It was a full, ringing laugh that bounced off the glass walls as if even they found my request amusing. He laughed so hard he had to steady himself on the table. I watched him, my expression unchanged. But something inside my chest went cold, colder than the room itself. When he finally stopped, Charles looked at me with a mix of pity and amusement and said I was just a spreadsheet person. People like me, he said, could be found anywhere. A spreadsheet, in his words, could always be done by someone else. Then he added a sentence I will remember for the rest of my life. If you think you are worth more, go find somewhere else. This is just business. Just business. I had heard that phrase for years, but it had never sounded as frigid as it did then. I closed the folio with a slow, measured motion, slow enough to hide the slight tremor in my hands, not from fear, but from a truth rising inside me, sharp as the edge of a blade. I looked at him and said the only thing that could be said in that moment. I understand. Thank you. But in my mind, I knew I did not understand anything except this. I had misjudged 14 years. I stood and left the room. No one called after me. No one asked another question. The heavy glass door closed behind me, the way it must have closed behind countless others. When the elevator opened, I stepped inside and caught my reflection in the polished steel. I looked the same as I had that morning. Long gray coat, hair tied low, calm face. But the person in the reflection was not the same woman who had walked into that meeting 30 minutes earlier. The woman in the mirror understood that her loyalty had just been priced at the value of a single laugh. As the elevator slid downward floor by floor, I exhaled. Not a weary breath, but the kind you let out when you realize the road ahead has split. And for the first time in a long time, you get to choose. Choice can be frightening, but it also frees you in the simplest, quietest way. And if you are listening to this, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? New York, California, or some city halfway across the world? And have you ever asked for something you genuinely believed you deserved, only to be met with a laugh? A laugh that made you understand that effort does not always earn respect. If it has, I want you to know one thing. You were never alone. I left Harbor Point's headquarters with the sense that I had just walked out of a room where a single sentence could change the way you see yourself. Manhattan at night had that cold and busy beauty, the kind only a city can have when it does not care what you are going through. I hurried across the slick sidewalk, wanting nothing more than to get home, but before leaving, I stopped by my small office on the 8th floor. The whole floor was nearly empty. Only a few desk lamps were still on, and a few coworkers glanced up when they saw me return. No one knew what had happened in the top floor conference room. They looked at me the way people look at someone walking back from a long meeting, guessing silently, but not asking. I did not want to tell them anyway. I gathered the documents I needed, shut down my computer, and left the office that had held almost half my working life. The late train to Queens was always crowded, but that night it felt strangely quiet. Maybe because I was drifting through my own thoughts. Charles's laugh was still echoing in my head, sharp and clear, like someone had set a thin, heavy stone on my chest. Not painful, just heavy. My apartment in Queens was small but tidy, quiet in the way a place becomes when someone has lived alone for many years and grown accustomed to the silence. I made myself a cup of hot tea, sat at the table, and opened the old laptop that had been with me for years. Working in insurance trains you to document everything, and this laptop, despite its age, was where I kept everything that belonged only to me. When the screen lit up, I opened a folder almost no one knew existed: Personal Models. That folder went back to my earliest years at Harbor Point. I remembered exactly why I had thrown myself into building models after hours. Back then, my mother had just come out of major surgery. The medical bills kept us awake at night. Harbor Point paid most of the cost and helped her recover without pushing us into debt. I had seen that as someone tossing me a lifeline at the exact moment I needed one. And that lifeline became the reason I gave so much without hesitation. I opened one of the first models in the folder. Every file was carefully dated, with detailed notes, created after hours, on personal equipment, with simulated data. I had always been meticulous, not because I feared the company, but because I wanted everything clear, so no one would ever think I was claiming something that belonged to them or surrendering something that belonged to me. As I opened the files, I remembered the emails I had sent years ago, asking the legal department whether the company wanted to formalize the use of the models I had developed on my own time. I even suggested a symbolic compensation, not because I needed money, but because I believed clear agreements protected everyone. When I reopened those emails, I found them exactly where I had left them, answered with either short replies or none at all. One email had only 3 words: "We will see." Those 3 words stretched on for 10 years. I leaned back in my chair and opened the employment contract I had signed my first year at Harbor Point. I had not read it in years. At the time, all I cared about was getting the job and securing health insurance for my mother. I turned to the section about intellectual property. The clause spelled out everything developed during working hours, on company devices, or with real data. But it said nothing about anything created after hours, on personal equipment, with simulated data. I read every line, every word. It felt like staring at my younger self's signature from 14 years ago, rushed and hopeful, as if I had signed a promise I never fully understood. When I looked back at the personal models folder, I saw something I had never named out loud. These models, under the contract, did not belong to the company. They belonged to me. Every note, every timestamp, every condition of development proved it. And the irony was that I had never thought about protecting my own rights, only because I believed my dedication would be understood. But the company's silence had already told me everything. I opened one of the models, Harbor Point, now used as the foundation for pricing in 3 major states. I remembered the nights I wrote it, long after the city had gone to sleep. I had felt proud knowing the company used it, thinking I was doing something that mattered. But tonight, placing the model beside that vague employment contract, I felt like someone who had handed over the key to her own house without realizing it. The small room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the clock. I sat in front of the screen, the personal models folder open like a private record of all those years. From where I stood now, I could not understand why I ever believed those things naturally belonged to Harbor Point. Harbor Point had once been a place I trusted, almost considered family. But tonight, it showed itself clearly for what it was: a business entity with contracts, clauses, and interests. And if it was a business, then what belonged to me deserved to be protected, not out of spite or revenge, but because I was the only one with the right to do it. I closed the contract and looked at the glowing screen. I did not yet know that the harmless notes in my personal models folder would soon become the center of a story Harbor Point never saw coming. But that night, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Everything had moved to a new chapter, and this chapter would not be written with loyalty anymore. It would be written with the clarity of someone who finally read her own contract. A few days passed after I met with Charles, and Harbor Point stayed quiet in a way that felt almost polite. No one asked what had happened in that conference room. No one seemed concerned. Everything kept moving as if I were just another part in the machine, and if a part malfunctioned, they would simply polish it and keep it running. I still finished the reports, adjusted a few models when asked, but I knew my connection to this place had cracked long ago. Now the cracks were finally visible. That evening, in my quiet apartment in Queens, I opened my personal laptop. I was not planning anything specific. I just wanted to see whether there was something I had overlooked all these years. The personal models folder was still there, familiar enough to feel almost comforting. But I did not open it. Instead, I went to my inbox and searched for the words Evergreen Mutual. A row of old emails appeared, and among them was a name I had nearly forgotten. Daniel Park. I remembered the conference in Chicago 3 years earlier. I had presented on cyclical risk simulations, and the Q&A stretched longer than expected because so many people had questions. But Daniel was the only one who did not ask about the technical details. He asked why I chose to model based on patient behavior instead of relying solely on pure statistical patterns. He said the way I combined mathematics with human understanding was rare. He handed me his card and said one thing. If you want to work in a place that values both fairness and capability, call me. I never called, not because I did not want to, but I thought loyalty was the most honorable thing an employee could offer. Looking back, I realized I had confused gratitude with resignation. I opened Daniel's email. A few short lines, clear and unembellished. He said he had followed my work through various presentations and believed I had far more potential than what Harbor Point allowed me to use. I stared at the call button for a long moment. Charles's voice echoed in my head, sharp as ever. If you think you are worth more, try somewhere else. He had no idea that sentence would become the final push I needed. I pressed call. Daniel answered almost immediately. When I said my name, he did not sound surprised. He simply asked what made me decide it was time to leave. I did not mention Charles's laughter. I only said I wanted to work in a place that recognized intellectual labor correctly, a place where ethical boundaries were not stretched thin just to maximize profit. Some truths do not need detailed stories. The right listeners understand. Daniel told me to come to Boston that week to meet Evergreen's leadership. His tone was calm but held the certainty of someone who had already thought this through. I agreed. 3 days later, I landed in Boston on a clear morning. This city was quieter than Manhattan and carried a sense of steadiness I had not felt in a long time. Evergreen Mutual's office sat in a simple stone building. No flashiness, no wide lobby designed to display power. Everything looked like it was built to function, not impress. I walked through the hallway, watching how people worked. They were busy, but not frantic. Small groups discussed things with a straightforward but gentle tone. There was no underlying tension like at Harbor Point, where every elevator ride felt like a silent arena for unspoken battles. In the meeting room, Daniel introduced me to the leadership team. The handshakes were neat and respectful, without unnecessary theatrics. I gave a brief overview of the work I had done, building and maintaining complex pricing models for Harbor Point. I made it clear I had brought no client data, no internal documents, and that my personal models used only simulated data on my own device. I restated my ethical boundaries with calm certainty. I was not defending myself, I was stating facts. They listened closely. When I finished, one of them said, Evergreen had noticed Harbor Point's sudden leap in predictive accuracy in recent years, but the consistency of the modeling style suggested the work could not be the product of a committee. It felt like the signature of one person. I did not respond. That was not why I had come. Another person spoke next. Evergreen wanted to build a more transparent pricing system, one that helped customers understand why they were charged, what they were charged, and how they could reduce their health risks. They said that philosophy aligned with the perspective in my past presentations. Then they made the offer. Director of Pricing Strategy, triple my current salary, equity, and the authority to shape a modeling framework built on a more humane foundation. I listened, staying quiet long enough to check in with myself. For years, I had wondered whether I deserved something better. Now I knew the answer, but I also knew caution was necessary. I asked to use my own attorney to review every contract, not just rely on Evergreen's legal explanations. I wanted clarity from the beginning. Daniel did not hesitate. Evergreen would cover all the legal costs, he said. We want an honest start. It was not a poetic line. It felt like a commitment in its truest form. When the meeting ended, I stepped onto the small balcony overlooking the Boston street. Everything below moved in its usual rhythm. People walking, a bus is pulling up, a few patrons are drinking coffee by the window. This city promised me nothing, but it demanded nothing either, except that I choose for myself. In that moment, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not safety, but agency. This choice was not about fighting Harbor Point or seeking revenge. It was simply about putting my value where it would be respected. And in the cool Boston air, I understood that this was the first step I was taking entirely on my own, no longer held in place by the old reasons that bound me for so many years. About 2 weeks after my trip to Boston, I received the official offer from Evergreen Mutual. The temporary contract my attorney reviewed came with a short note from their team. Every term is transparent. No traps, only opportunity. I read the offer one more time, then signed it. As the pen touched the page, I felt something I had not felt in years. This decision was mine, not for anyone else, and not to make anyone proud. The next morning, I arrived at Harbor Point earlier than usual, not because I wanted to hold on to anything, but because I wanted to end things in the quiet of the morning. I walked into my office, set my coat on the chair, and took the white envelope I had prepared. My resignation letter was only one page, without long explanations. I wrote only what needed to be written, short, polite, without excess emotion. When I stepped into the glass room on the top floor one last time, the feeling was entirely different from the time before. That last time, I carried a thick binder to prove my worth. This time, I had nothing left to prove. Charles was standing with his back to the door, looking down at Central Park as if he were deep in thought. He turned when he heard the light knock. I placed the envelope on the table. He glanced at it and asked, without genuine interest, "What is this, Lauren?" I answered, "My resignation." He opened the envelope, pulled out the letter, and skimmed it. His expression did not change, as if he had seen hundreds of letters like it. He asked for a reason, his voice flat. Burnout. Family issues. "No," I said. "I am moving to Evergreen Mutual." This time, the change was real. It lasted only a moment, but I saw it. His eyes were no longer indifferent. Evergreen was not a name he wanted to hear. They were a direct competitor, a company gaining market share by making pricing transparent, something Harbor Point always treated as a luxury they could not afford. I had never seen Charles so quiet. He set the letter on the table and looked at me more closely, as if reevaluating something he thought he already understood. The first thing he asked was, "Did you take anything with you?" I knew exactly what he meant. Not a chair, not paperwork. He meant the models. He meant what he believed was the company's default property. I answered calmly, "I am taking my own knowledge and the models I developed after hours on personal equipment. Harbor Point never purchased them." He did not argue right away, but his eyes shifted, not angry, calculating. The kind of calculation I had seen many times in strategy meetings, when he viewed something as a threat that needed to be neutralized early. The meeting ended without a thank you or good luck. I walked out knowing this was far from over. That afternoon, I noticed the legal department moving more than usual. There were hurried phone calls, questions about archived emails, contract clauses, and model submission history. Small pieces of evidence indicated a search had begun. They wanted to know what I had sent, what I had saved, and what I had used. Not to understand, but to find leverage, or to make my departure more expensive. I was not surprised. People who feel their control slipping will do anything to regain it. 3 days later, I received an invitation to return to the glass room. Charles waited as if he were the one initiating the meeting. He said he wanted to discuss things further before my departure became official. He went straight to the point. The company was willing to raise my salary. Not 10%, but 15, even 20. If I stayed, he would consider a higher role, something closer to management. Promises he could have made years ago. But then he added, in return, you must sign a new intellectual property clause. It states that every model related to pricing, even those developed after ours, belongs to Harbor Point. That is the condition for us to move forward. I looked at him. What he said sounded like an offer, but also a gentle threat. A proposition wrapped in a calm tone but woven with control. I replied. That is what you could have said before you laughed at me. The sentence was not loud, not sharp, but it ended the conversation cleanly. I stood, thanked him for the discussion, and walked out. No need to look back. On the way to the elevator, I understood that from this moment on, this was no longer just an employee leaving a company. It had become a collision between two ways of seeing people. One side believed value came from position and power. The other believed it came from capability and integrity. And for the first time in years, I was standing firmly on my own side. A few months after leaving Harbor Point, life at Evergreen felt like I was slowly returning to a normal rhythm. I grew used to meetings that did not rely on glass rooms to project authority. Colleagues spoke frankly, and the transparency-based pricing model my team was building received positive responses from customers. There was no mocking laughter in this building, only one recurring question. Does this help policyholders understand better? But that calm did not last long. One Monday morning, just as I set my coffee on the desk, Daniel appeared at my door. He said nothing at first, only handed me a thick stack of papers. One glance told me everything. Harbor Point was suing me in federal court, accusing me of stealing trade secrets, and carrying a strategic weapon to Evergreen. I placed the stack on my desk, feeling its weight not just in pages. I was not surprised, yet there was a small moment when my breath slowed. Maybe it was the feeling of seeing my name in a lawsuit for the first time. During all my years at Harbor Point, I imagined that if my name ever appeared in the news, it would be for a meaningful study. Clearly, I had overestimated the romanticism of this industry. 2 days later, Harbor Point released a public statement. They called me a disgruntled former employee and suggested Evergreen had used tactics to steal trade secrets. They did not need to be direct. A few vague phrases were enough for older audiences to nod. Another young person with no loyalty. Several financial channels repeated the claim word for word, not bothering to check the context. An evening newscast even added, this is yet another example of declining commitment among the younger workforce. I watched the screen, listened to the anchor judge me with solemn confidence, and felt my mouth curve slightly. It was amusing how people who could not write a single line of code always felt so comfortable lecturing about algorithms. Evergreen did not respond with a statement. They responded with action. They assembled a full legal team, bringing in both their attorneys and mine. We gathered evidence, model logs, timestamps, simulation files, and most importantly, the emails in which I had asked Harbor Point to formalize any transfer of intellectual property. They had ignored them as if they were trivial reminders. On the first day in court, the hallway outside was crowded with reporters. I did not hide my face, nor did I answer questions. Daniel walked beside me, not for optics, but as a quiet reminder that I was no longer alone in this fight. In their opening argument, Harbor Point's representatives claimed every model I ever created was tied to my employment, regardless of time or device. They tried to cast me as a company instrument, not a person with a life beyond office hours. In their view, my mind belonged to Harbor Point the moment I stepped through their doors. My attorney carefully unfolded each document, untangling the case like a knotted thread. Models developed, on personal equipment, late at night or on weekends, using simulated data with clear annotations, proposals to transfer ownership, and Harbor Point's vague responses. When she asked their representative, if you believe these models belong to the company, why did you never complete the purchase? There was a moment of silence that spoke louder than any objection. Harbor Point tried redirecting. They asked the court for restrictions preventing Evergreen from deploying any model I had created. They called it a market protection measure. I listened, feeling as if I were watching their old habit play out again. When they could not win with facts, they tried pulling their opponent backward. But then the press began asking the questions Harbor Point had hoped to avoid. An investigative reporter from a major newspaper dug into how Harbor Point had used pricing algorithms over the years. At first, the piece was purely technical, but a week later, it evolved into a human story. An elderly couple from the Midwest, who had paid premiums faithfully for decades, were suddenly reclassified by an algorithm and pushed into unaffordable rates. They lost coverage right when the husband needed heart surgery. They told their story calmly, without bitterness, and that restraint made it hit even harder. The article spread quickly, shifting public perception. No one cared much anymore about whether I had been loyal. They began asking a bigger question. Who are these algorithms designed to serve? A question Harbor Point could not answer with a press release. Morning broadcasts grew less harsh. Some journalists contacted Evergreen requesting an interview about ethical responsibility in pricing models. I answered carefully. I did not want to become a hero. But I was not going to let myself be framed as a villain either. By the end of the first week of hearings, there was no ruling yet. That was normal. Intellectual property disputes, especially in the insurance sector, take time. But I could feel something had shifted. I was no longer the center of the story, and strangely, that made everything feel lighter. The public was now seeing what I had seen for years. Not merely an overlooked employee, not merely an arrogant chief executive, but a system deciding people's lives through algorithms that no one was accountable for. I left the courthouse that afternoon, walking between rows of reporters still taking photos. I did not look at them. I only knew one thing clearly. This story had moved beyond the courtroom. It had outgrown me, Evergreen, and Harbor Point. And for the first time since leaving my old company, I did not feel like I was defending myself anymore. I was simply telling the truth. 6 months after the first hearing, the federal court released its ruling. The decision was long, dense with clauses and statutes, but the essential conclusion was surprisingly short. The court dismissed most of Harbor Point's accusations. I had not stolen trade secrets. The models I developed after hours on personal equipment were ruled personal work. A few technical parameters were adjusted to avoid overlapping proprietary variables, but nothing changed the substance. No fines, no career restrictions. I read the final page and set the packet down. Daniel stepped into the room, tilting his head as if asking how it went. I simply said, "It is fine." Because truthfully, I did not feel victorious. The legal part was resolved, but the larger problem was still out there, where policyholders lived under models they never got to understand. At Evergreen, the new pricing framework my team developed was spreading quickly. We introduced clearer fee structures, especially for seniors and people with chronic conditions. Advisors encouraged customers to call directly with any questions they had. One elderly woman called and said, her voice trembling slightly, "I never thought I would understand a pricing model, but today I did." That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. The media began to notice the contrast. Evergreen transparent. Harbor Point is raising fees without a clear explanation. Many articles did not mention my name, and I preferred it that way. I did not want to become the face of the entire industry. All I wanted was for the transparent model to actually help someone. Meanwhile, Harbor Point began to slide. For nearly a year, they ran their aging algorithms like someone driving a car long overdue for maintenance. With no staff capable of recalibrating the models, the errors grew sharper. In some states, premiums jumped suddenly, pushing customers away. In others, premiums were set lower than actual risk, causing losses the company could not explain. The algorithms, once labeled strategic weapons, had become unstable machines running on inertia. Insurance regulators in 3 major states demanded explanations. A federal investigation was opened into whether Harbor Point had unfairly priced senior customers. Investors began questioning the leadership during shareholder meetings as profit margins continued to fall. The stock price dropped with no sign of stopping. I did not feel satisfied. A financial analyst might call it a market cycle, but I knew better. This was the consequence of a system optimized so aggressively for short-term gains that it forgot it needed people to function in the long run. A system that cannot correct itself will always break at its weakest point. 9 months after my departure, Harbor Point announced a restructuring. In this industry, restructuring is a gentle word for something not gentle at all. Mass layoffs. A leaked internal document appeared in the press, and I immediately recognized the long list of departments being cut. The names on the screen made me pause. Someone who once taught me how to read granular data lines in my first week. Someone who brought pastries every Monday. Someone who defended me in a meeting when I was too new to defend myself. They had not caused the strategic failures, but they were the first to be hit. Daniel walked into my office and saw me staring at the report. He asked if I wanted him to turn off the news. I shook my head, not because I wanted to keep watching, but because I still did not know how to feel. Part of me understood that every ruthless system eventually cracks, but another part struggled with the fact that the breaking point had fallen on people with the softest voices. That evening, I turned the television back on to watch the recap. The anchor spoke about strategic restructuring, capital efficiency, and workforce realignment. Clean phrases, polished, sterile. But the images behind the words were painfully real. Someone is packing their belongings into a cardboard box. Someone else is waiting for the elevator with red eyes. I switched the television off when the list grew another page longer. I did not need to see more. The story was not in the numbers. I opened my laptop to check Evergreen's internal emails. Between meeting reminders and technical reports, one headline stood out. Evergreen is expanding teams, hiring across multiple departments. The market was shifting toward us, and the demand for staff was understandable. I read the memo twice. Then I thought of Harbor Point's layoff list. I thought of the faces of people I once worked beside. I thought of how systems can collapse due to flawed philosophy, but people do not have to collapse with them. An idea began to form in my mind. For now, it was shapeless, but steady, like a heartbeat, a new direction. A way to face the fallout I never intended to create, but could no longer pretend not to see. I closed the laptop. The idea did not yet have a name, but I knew it would bring me back to the industry's biggest question. Do we price risk, or do we price people? And I knew it was time to do something before another list appeared on a screen. On Monday morning, Evergreen's office in Boston carried its usual calm. Light streamed through the tall glass panels, the coffee machine hissed awake, and employees moved through the hall with the steady confidence of people who knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. I was reviewing the weekly report when the receptionist called. An older woman was in the lobby asking to see me. She only said she had once worked at Harbor Point. The receptionist sounded hesitant, the kind of hesitation that comes from trying to guess whether the visit was friendly or confrontational. I told her to bring the woman up. When the door opened, I saw Margaret standing there. Her posture was still straight, but something in her shoulders had settled lower. She had been the customer service manager at Harbor Point, known for a way of speaking that made policyholders feel genuinely heard. She held a worn brown bag with both hands, gripping it as if it anchored her. She looked like someone who had not slept well for days, but her voice remained steady. Lauren. I led her into the small conference room next to my office. Margaret stood still for a moment before sitting down, as if choosing a place to set her thoughts. Do you remember that we had lunch together a few times? She asked. I nodded. I remembered very clearly. She once told me I should ask for more, at least enough not to be shortchanged. I laughed back then, thinking she said it out of the wisdom of age. Now I saw she had been right in a way I refused to acknowledge. Margaret placed the bag down and exhaled. My entire department was laid off. All of them. Most over 50. She paused, eyes fixed on me. A lot of people think you are part of the reason. No one says it directly, but you know that kind of silence. I knew. Silence that sits like an unwritten accusation. Margaret continued, I am not here to ask for a job. I just wanted to see with my own eyes whether what you have now is worth the price other people paid. The question fell between us, stopping the room in place. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the need to understand something she could not articulate. Is it worth it? It was a question I had not allowed myself to face fully. I drew a slow breath, placing my emotions where they belonged. I did not take customer data. I did not take internal documents. The after-hours models were personal work. I asked Harbor Point many times to formalize ownership, and they ignored me. I left because I had to protect my own work. Margaret listened in silence, not agreeing, not rejecting. But, I continued, I will not pretend my decision is not one piece of that collapse. Not the whole picture, but a piece. She held my gaze longer, not with anger, but with something heavier. Quiet disappointment. In her eyes, I saw the faces of the older employees, whose names appeared on the layoff lists, and I understood. For them, this was never about legal correctness. It was about the feeling of being pushed out of a ship they had trusted for decades. I asked, if Evergreen offered a path for people like you, would you consider it? Margaret gave a faint, tired smile. I am 62, Lauren. I am not sure I have the strength to start over, at least not in the old way. When she left the room, I felt as though I had been handed a task no one assigned but one I could not ignore. She stepped into the elevator, still holding the bag tightly, and I realized her question was not meant to accuse me. It was to force me to decide what I intended to do next. That afternoon, I went to see Daniel. You have an idea, he said before I even spoke. Daniel always knew when I had been thinking too much. I laid it out plainly. Operation Second Chance. Part 1. Prioritize interviews for those laid off from Harbor Point, not out of charity, but because their experience was valuable to Evergreen. Part 2. Create part-time advisory roles for those nearing retirement, so people like Margaret would not be forced back into full-time intensity, yet still have a place to contribute. Part 3. Provide retraining programs in technology for people over 50, not symbolic workshops, but real training with structure and commitment. Daniel listened, pressing 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose as he weighed the risks. He asked, do you think Evergreen should do this out of ethical responsibility or long-term strategy? Both, I answered. A company focused only on quarterly profit will never survive a crisis cycle. The people harmed by the old system are not variables. They are part of this industry. Daniel leaned back, his expression softening. I am not opposed, but leadership will ask whether we are taking on someone else's problem. It is not someone else's problem, I said. It is the industry's problem. You cannot change a system and leave its casualties behind. That is not reform. That is rebranding. Daniel laughed quietly, a rare sound. You know, sometimes I think you did not leave Harbor Point just to get justice for yourself. I think you're left to restart an entire reform. If I said that was not true, no one would believe me, I answered. 2 weeks later, Operation Second Chance was approved. The day Margaret returned, this time with a small but genuine smile, the room felt brighter in a way I could not explain. She accepted the role of senior customer advisor, working 3 days a week. A small office was prepared for her, only a few steps from mine. She set her bag on the desk, straightened her back with her old habit, and said, I am not sure this erases the past, but at least it stops things from ending the worst way. I said, sometimes less damage is already a victory. As I watched Margaret arrange her first papers on her new desk, I understood something. Operation Second Chance was not meant to erase anyone's mistakes. It was meant to build something different from the wreckage, not to save a system, but to save the people who once held it up. And in that moment, the question, is it worth it, no longer scared me. Because I knew I was trying to make it worth it. Nearly a year after the afternoon Charles laughed in my face in the top-floor glass room at Harbor Point, the news broke. The company had officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The broadcast showed employees carrying cardboard boxes out of the building, and among them was Charles, walking slowly, heavily, his coat uneven on one shoulder, his eyes fixed on the ground. Nothing remained of the man who once leaned back in a leather chair and laughed loudly when someone asked for a 10% raise. That evening, his email arrived. The subject line was short, a final meeting. I read it twice. Part of me wanted to delete it immediately. Another part understood that in any life, there are confrontations that never resolve on their own, but still require one last conversation to close the arc. I replied, agreeing to meet, but at Evergreen's office, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Boston. This time, the space would belong to me. Charles arrived on time. He walked in with the caution of someone who no longer trusted his old instincts. As soon as he sat, he said without preamble, I owe you an apology. I stayed silent. It was time for him to speak for himself. He admitted plainly, after you left, I went back to the emails you sent about formalizing IP rights for the models. I remembered reading them, but at the time I thought nothing needed to be done. I assumed you would never leave the company. I was completely wrong. His voice did not shake, but something in it had fallen away, the layer of confidence that used to come from power. He continued, slower this time. I underestimated you because I believed no one walks away when they are still needed. And when you actually did leave, I reacted like a CEO under threat. I used legal force to maintain control. It was not the right decision. It was not the decision of a decent man, I answered simply. You used power to threaten someone you knew was right. That was not pressure. That was a choice. Charles lifted his eyes. For the first time in years, he did not try to justify anything. He simply said, You are right. Then he spoke of shareholder pressure, quarterly growth races, spreadsheets tracking every fraction of cost. In that environment, delaying a 10% raise seemed rational. But, he said, logic on paper never explains what breaks inside a person. A quiet space opened between us. I felt no pity, no lingering anger, only the sense of a long arc closing. Charles drew a breath. The laugh that day. I know it hurt you. I am sorry for that. And I am sorry for not seeing your value when I had the chance to do the right thing, I said. Charles, every company has pressure, but pressure does not erase ethical boundaries. A leader must know what can be sacrificed and what never should. He nodded, not the nod of someone pretending to understand, but of someone who had finally accepted the truth. Before standing, he said something that genuinely surprised me. Tomorrow I have my final meeting with the bankruptcy team and the employee representatives. I want to propose Evergreen's Operation Second Chance as a support plan for the remaining staff. I was silent for a few seconds. Then I asked, Why? Not to save my reputation, he said. That is gone. But I want the people who believed in me for so many years to have a chance to start again somewhere they are not treated like a burden. I understood him. And I also understood that the program did not belong to him. It belonged to the people trying to find a path after the system they served collapsed. I said, Fine. But this time, do it for them. Not for the stock price, not for the board, and not for me. Charles stood. He did not extend his hand, and he did not ask for forgiveness. He only bowed his head slightly, then left the room. As he passed by the glass wall, his reflection looked smaller than the man I once faced in that Manhattan conference room. Small enough that he nearly blended into the hallway. I watched him go, feeling no triumph, only a simple truth. The villain in a story is not always a monster. Sometimes he is just someone who carried the wrong choices of a system too far, and in the end has to pay for them with the one thing he thought he owned: power. The meeting ended without raised voices, no forced explanations, no performative forgiveness. But there was one unmistakable clarity. Charles's arc had closed, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the moment he understood something small, yet enormous. None of us ever has the right to treat a person as expendable just to make a spreadsheet look better. And sometimes realizing that late is still better than never. On an early autumn morning, nearly 1 year after Harbor Point officially filed for bankruptcy protection, I stood on the stage of the National Conference on Ethics in Health Data Analytics. The room was wide, the ceiling tall, and the soft yellow lights reflected off rows of attendees, most of them longtime experts in the field, their hair more gray than not. I felt a quiet unlike any other, not tension, but the silence of people who had lived long enough to know every story has more than one side. I began with the truth that once cut deeply into me. I used to believe loyalty was the shield that protected a career, and for 14 years, I believed that if I did things right, if I did them well, the system would see me. Then one day I asked for a 10% raise, an amount not even enough to buy a studio apartment in Manhattan, and what I received in return was a laugh. A few people in the audience lowered their heads, smiling faintly. Not because it was humorous, but because they had heard a similar laugh before from a supervisor, a board member, someone convinced that talent was interchangeable with a signature on a hiring form. I told the story with only the details that mattered. No bitterness, no avoidance. I spoke about how a company can slide past its ethical boundaries without noticing, simply because it grows accustomed to optimizing profit first and thinking about people second. I spoke about how pricing models, numbers without emotion, can become real barriers for those who need insurance the most. I did not mention Charles by name. I did not call anyone a villain. But I did talk about the moment I was forced to re examine my own worth in what felt like an insignificant instant. In the front row, I saw Margaret. She sat upright, her expression still carrying the sharpness of someone who once ran a large customer service department. Beside her were former Harbor Point employees now working at Evergreen or elsewhere. Their faces were quiet, but calmer than the first time I saw them after the layoffs. There was a slow recovery taking shape. I transitioned into discussing Operation Second Chance, the program Evergreen approved after my proposal. I did not present it as an achievement, but as a response. When a system collapses, the first step is not judgment. It is rebuilding a path for the people buried under the rubble. I said that by now, hundreds of former Harbor Point employees had found roles through the program, from full-time positions to part-time advisory work for those nearing retirement. The transition was not easy, but at least they no longer stood before an empty horizon. Next, I shared the mentoring initiative I started for women in the actuarial field. I taught them 3 things. 1, document your accomplishments every year. 2, read your employment contract, especially the intellectual property clause, like a map of your own boundaries. 3, negotiate your salary without apologizing for existing. The audience nodded at the last point, and a few older attendees even smiled, as if realizing they should have learned that 30 years ago. Then came the Q&A. A senior student stood and asked with sincere curiosity, "Do you think you played a part in Harbor Point's collapse?" The room went silent. Not tense, just waiting, I said. I take responsibility for my actions. I left because I could not stay in a place that undervalued me. But if a company collapses because one person leaves, the problem is not the person who left. A healthy organization should survive even the departure of its best talent. Harbor Point could not do that, and the reason lies within them, not within me. The student nodded, and a soft wave of applause filled the room. I breathed slowly, not out of emotion, but because I knew I had spoken aloud something many in that room had been thinking for years. No one person has the power to destroy a company unless the company is already broken. A few days after the conference, I received a small package. Inside was a printed article analyzing Harbor Point's downfall and Evergreen's rise. Between the pages was a card. I should have listened to you sooner. See. I stood at my desk for a long moment, the card in my hand. Not because I felt personal emotion, but because I understood the weight of that apology. It came from someone who once believed he could not be wrong. It did not rewrite the past, but it confirmed something important. That laugh no longer had any power over me. I framed the article and hung it in my office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder to myself and my team that every major story begins with a small moment, like a single laugh. And that moment only holds power if we refuse to look it in the eye. At the end of the talk, I looked into the camera and spoke to the people watching the recording. If you are 60, 61, or 70, and you have ever been laughed at for asking for what you believed was the bare minimum, remember this. It is never too late to reprice yourself. It is never too late to say you deserve better than how you were treated. I invited them to share whether they had lived something similar and where they were watching from. Their stories helped me understand how Americans from New York, Ohio, Arizona, or even abroad learn to stand up for themselves in their own quiet ways. Then I said, in a calm voice, meant for one listener at a time, if you want more stories that are gentle but sharp, stories about finding your voice in places that pretend not to hear you, subscribe to the channel, not for the numbers, but so we have a place to talk about what deserves to be said. I turned off the camera. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the story had finally closed, not with revenge, but with growth.